someone in a privileged position who was engaged in some kind of corrupt behavior or wrongdoing was exposed for, and is then sort of trying to cover the tracks years later. Now, this might seem to be in tension with what I've described earlier about we need an ephemerality of data. We need to make records about ourselves evaporate after a given time. And I think this is easier to see if you think about the renewal of memory and how that operates on a social scale rather than on a commercial scale. The reality is what we have and has been eroded by the emergence of technology is a right to privacy, which put more simply is the right to be left alone. If we are not in a position of public influence, this can be corporate, this can be governmental, right? It doesn't have to be merely governmental, but anyone who has a position of particular influence in society should be held to a higher standard of scrutiny. This is a well understood limitation on the right to privacy. But what about the individual who is not in a position of public influence? Again, what about the child? What about the adult but younger person online who says something that was dumb or wrong or offensive? Should they be haunted forever by the mistakes of their past, by things that they wish they could leave behind? It's not about enforcing the right to be forgotten so much as recognizing these records throughout the entire story of humanity have existed only in the memory of those close to you. You know, you might wake up in the middle of the night, 20 years after a fact, and remember some argument that you had with a parent or a spouse or a child where you said something dumb or embarrassing or cruel, and you regret it. You wish you could rewind it. And the funny thing is, the other party to that incident, to that argument, to that embarrassing moment, doesn't remember it at all because it wasn't substantive. But we are sort of haunted by our own memory, and our brain, through the peculiarities of biology, will occasionally, wake you up at 3 a.m. You're trying to go to sleep, you're tired or whatever. It's like, hey, now's a good time to revisit our classic photo album. Now, in smaller human societies, the people who knew you were the people who are around you. You were accountable to them insofar as you interacted with them. You had a direct relationship with them. And if you wanted to avoid them, you could move away from them. You could skip town. You could reinvent yourself. Or you could restart yourself. But when those systems of observation and accountability, which lead to prejudice, are institutionalized and divorced from geography, they're divorced from direct relationship, now you can no longer explain yourself because the other parties are global. They don't know you and they don't care about you. You cannot escape them because there is nowhere to go. They are an interrelated network. And what do you do? How do you restart with this? And I think this is where the right to be forgotten is a difficult thing. I can't say whether it's correct or incorrect. Maybe it is the correct construct. Maybe it is the correct idea. It is simply implemented and regulated improperly. But what we need is a shelf life on these records, or we should explore at least the idea of a shelf life on these records. So just like human memories fade, now our systemic memory can fade. However, and this is where the right to be forgotten becomes a little bit difficult. I don't believe we can order someone to forget, particularly in injustice done to them. We can invite them to forget. We can encourage them. We can give them every opportunity by caring for them, by trying to ameliorate or remediate the wrong that was done to them, and give them an opportunity to heal. But at the same time, I think if we order people to denounce their own memories, that can lead us to a very dark place, particularly when we start talking about these are corporatized or governmentalized processes that are directed and ordered by political creatures. However, if we can create a system, at least in theory, where what we do is we try to emulate that evaporation of human memory, save in exceptionally powerful circumstances. For example, when our brain wakes us up 20 years later because it wants us to learn from a mistake that embarrassed us, that I think is a better model.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at too is the option to choose, right? Where we're giving ourselves more choices. We have more information. We're able to make educated decisions about what's good for us rather than being profiled and being nudged in certain directions, especially for kids at a very, very young age who may not realize that this is going on. Looking forward, in order to build a better digital infrastructure for ourselves and for future generations, it seems like we need to come at this from many different angles. There's no one silver bullet solution. And first, I want to talk about kind of the public sector, the governmental response. In previous interviews, you've mentioned that, it shouldn't be completely left up to the individual to fend for themselves against these very powerful technologies. How do we push for governments, or how should governments be thinking about this in order to create a more human-centered approach to these topics of privacy and data protection?
I think one of the most interesting things about the problem of, let's say, surveillance capitalism today, and the rise of surveillance states that it has produced, is how clearly this entire regime is based on a single principle, which is that records can be created about a person by third parties, and they are not owned by the person, the subject of the records, but rather they are owned by the creators of the records. This is the entire house of cards. Now, in the United States legal system, this is known as the third-party doctrine. It is a sort of walk around the judicial warrant requirement for police work is the origins of it. And it was decided in the 1970s. When the internet as it exists today would have been a fantastic leap of the imagination for a 70-year-old judge sitting at the bench. But at the highest level, the courts decided that in an individual case where the police had an individual suspicion of wrongdoing on the part of a particular person, they could go to a third party, the phone company, ask the third party to share records voluntarily. The third party could do so, and this did not implicate the privacy rights of the subject of those records, the person who was being investigated. And the judge in this case, I think, was influenced because the person in this case actually was a criminal. The police were correct in identifying this person, but they bypassed the normal judicial process and they went, can we just get the phone company to play ball and show us these records? And the phone company said yes. The defense lawyer challenged this, and the court said, well, no, because they weren't his records. His privacy rights weren't implicated. They were the company's records, and the company was free to do whatever they wanted with them. This was a case called Smith versus Maryland in U.S. law. The problem is, in the 50 years since this decision, we have gone around the world. Well, if this reasoning holds for an individual in an individual case, it applies to the collective in the collective case. If one person doesn't have a right or an interest in their privacy or in their records held by a third party, then no one does.